afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with SNC Lavalin. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves into the assessment phase of the environmental assessment process. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. So let's get started. Today, what we're going to talk about is not the federal EA process or IA process, as you saw at the beginning there. We're going to talk about what's going to happen next after the environmental assessment. That's the provincial process, terms of reference approval. And the purpose is to help community members better understand the thinking behind and the activities associated with the process. So let's get started here and provide a little bit of background for everyone, just in case you're new to the project. We just like to get everybody up to the sort of same level in terms of information. And as background, this project will connect the Ring of Fire mineral deposits to the all-season highway network via the proposed uh, Martin Falls Community Access Road, which is another project which has started earlier and is occurring, and that would be the southern connection um, to the provincial highway system. And this project provides an opportunity for Webequie First Nation, which is to the north, to connect to the all-season highway network through its Webequie Supply Road, connecting with the Northern Road Link project. And just to give you some other background on the Ring of Fire, it's considered a very promising mineral development opportunity for Ontario, with a number of minerals present, including chromite, cobalt, nickel, copper, and platinum. This project is subject to the Environmental Assessment Act and into the Impact Assessment Act. Um, the proponents for this project are two First Nations, both remote communities, Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation. Both of these communities are about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, and of course are not currently accessible by all-season roads, only by winter roads. There have been a number of studies done previously on an all-season road to the Ring of Fire in 2020. Ontario, Martin Falls, and Webequie announced an agreement to work together, and then the communities agreed to be the proponents and conduct an environmental assessment for the project. Now, again, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but we want to show you where this project fits in with the other two all-season road projects. So to the north, there's the Webequie Supply Road, which runs from Webequie First Nation, the settlement area, to McFalds Lake. Then the Northern Road Link project would connect that to the Martin Falls Community Access Road, which would then connect with the provincial highway. And the purpose of the Northern Road Link project is to enable economic activity by allowing the efficient transport of goods, services, and resources. In terms of the project components, again, this is not just a two-lane gravel road. These all-season roads consist of other infrastructure elements. The road itself would be a multi-use gravel road, available and functioning all season, and it would be at least 117 kilometers in length and as much as 164 kilometers in length. And the reason why I'm giving you a range is because the actual final route has not yet been identified. There are a number of corridor alternatives right now, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. In terms of water crossings, there will be numerous crossings. consisting of culverts and bridges for the wider crossings where the span is greater. There will be one large bridge across the Attawapiskat River, where the span will be greater than 200 meters. And of course, as I mentioned, this project is more than just the 2-lane road. It consists of other infrastructure, including storage and laydown areas, maintenance facilities and yards, access roads, aggregate sites, and construction camps. So there's a lot of other infrastructure associated with a project like this. In terms of alternative corridors, there are a number of alternative corridor segments, in fact, 12 of them. And I don't want to confuse you too much with this map, but as you can see at this point, we are in the process of trying to identify a preferred corridor. And so you see a number of different segments here that are the result of having different options. So there's each corridor is sort of a planning area, and it's 2 kilometers in width. And the idea of the corridor is to allow for routing around constraints within a final preferred corridor. And there's a number of segment combinations that are possible. Um, about 10 combinations, it says here, for each of the A1 and A2 alternatives. And A1, the choice of A1 versus A2 depends on the chosen corridor for the Martin Falls Community Access Road. So it's dependent on that. In terms of these alternative corridors, they're based on terrain while also looking at other factors such as biological factors, natural features, um, indigenous knowledge constraints. A lot of the segments, as you see here, follow the esker, which is sort of an elevated natural feature that is surrounded by the James Bay lowlands. There were other corridors developed to accommodate different crossing locations of the Attawapiskat River, and the reason why there are different locations is because of some of the constraints, which include sturgeon habitat, moose habitat, and in indigenous values as well. The Ontario process uh, requires a very detailed assessment of alternatives and includes consideration of residual and net effects, or the leftover effects, basically, after applying what you call mitigation measures, or which are ways of reducing or lessening impact of something. Criteria are being developed to assess the advantages and disadvantages. These are things to study and measure and measure. There would be like associated measurements, such as indicators, measurement methods associated with each criteria, and these could be impacts on species at risk and their habitat, impacts on peatlands, and factors such as quantities of aggregate available as well. As I mentioned before, there are there are 3 different crossing locations identified, 2 what are called western ones, and then an eastern one. And so you can see them on the screen here. We've got some photos, and then we show the sort of the general vicinity where these crossings might occur. And again, these require further review and study as well to determine, and consultation with community members to identify a preferred crossing location. On the next slide, we have an overview of the provincial environmental assessment process. And in this, you'll see where we actually are. So you'll see the diamond-shaped figure on the top left-hand side, the minister's decision on the terms of reference. That has just occurred. That occurred right at the end of March. And so that means that the environmental assessment terms of reference, or the work plan for the environmental assessment, has been approved by the by MECP, the ministry. And once we learned of that, we then issued the environmental assessment notice of commencement, which is available on our website, northernroadlink.ca. This was issued in early April, as I'll get into a bit later. So you can see where we sit in the process right now. We have now moved from the planning phase of the environmental assessment process to the assessment phase. And so there's lots of work. The work really sort of intensifies now at this point. And then let's talk a little bit now about that terms of reference. Again, it's just been approved, officially approved. It went through a couple of different stages. It went through a draft phase, the draft terms of reference. This was circulated in November 2021. There was a 45-day review and comment period, which was then extended for another 30 days for Indigenous communities to allow communities to provide comments or ask any questions, any further questions. And then it moved to a proposed terms of reference, which was submitted in April of 2022 for a 60-day comment period. And this was then extended by an additional 90 days by MECP, by the provincial ministry, for Indigenous communities to December 14th, 2022. In the process of this review and our team, our technical team, received and responded to over 1,000 comments from regulators, Indigenous communities, and other stakeholders on the tour. Responses to the comments on the proposed tour were shared in November of 22, as I mentioned. Um, in response to many of the comments, changes were made to the terms of reference, and new commitments were made for the environmental assessment based on that input received. So all those comments and all that input did result in changes and adjustments to the work plan for the environmental assessment, to the terms of reference. So now we move to the notice of approval. This notice of approval was received on March 3rd, 2023. Um, this represents the end of the planning phase of the environmental assessment process, as I mentioned before. Now we move into the assessment phase. So the planning phase, where we develop the work plan or the terms of reference, is now complete. The work plan has been approved. Now we are executing that work plan. And again, we declared this publicly through the environmental assessment notice of commencement. And now, there we go. Sorry, I got my slides mixed up there. So that environmental assessment notice of commencement was published in local and regional newspapers during the first week of April. Letters were sent to chief and councils with offers to meet. We we make these offers on a regular basis because we want to get feedback from communities at any point in the process. And these efforts help identify, especially at this point, um, these efforts that we make by reaching out to communities to meet with them and get and solicit comments and feedback from them, help us update our contact list, because it allows us to identify people that are interested in the project and want to keep in contact and be informed about the project. And the next thing that occurs in this process is the baseline data collection and identification of alternatives. Um, We want to get input on the alternatives in terms of the specific routing of the road, ancillary infrastructure. So the infrastructure beyond just the road itself that I was talking about before, like the pits, like the quarries, like the laydown areas, the locations of construction camps, all that information is collected. We receive other information, and this is really important to the process, on criteria and indicators. I mentioned criteria is things to study, and the indicators are ways of measuring things to study, and I'll get into that in a few minutes in terms of describing that. And baseline information is being collected. We need to develop that baseline because the baseline information helps describe the way things are now, the existing conditions, and gives us a sort of a frame of reference, something to compare to down the road so we can look for any impacts. We also rely heavily on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous land and resource use to establish key areas, and identify constraints that help us identify a preferred corridor, a best corridor that has the least impact from many different perspectives. So, in terms of consultation and engagement, this will take many forms. Not only the form you're seeing right now in a live stream or virtual presentation, but we'll also be doing in-person meetings with communities. We encourage these. We'd prefer to meet face to face, and all we need is an invitation from your community, and we will be happy to come and visit and meet with you, respecting your consultation protocols as well too. We will also be having occasional open houses in Thunder Bay and perhaps other centers. Um, Virtual community meetings, as I mentioned, public open houses, live streams like this one, radio shows will also be done. We'll be probably doing radio shows on the Wawate Radio Network, um, which covers many of the communities that we are consulting with on this project. And we'll also be trying to do some special shows where we parallel develop we'll have our basic topics which parallel the environmental assessment process, but we'll also develop some special technical topics of interest to Indigenous community members, such as construction in wetland areas and species at risk studies. So these kinds of technical discussions about topics that people are really interested in, we want to develop special shows for these where we can bring in experts and have constructive discussions on how to deal with these issues. So we look to you as community members to provide us with some suggestions for topics for these kinds of discussions. Now, in terms of future project milestones and activities after round one, there's we move on to evaluation of alternatives. We get into selection of preferred methods, preliminary effects assessment, and cumulative effects assessment, review of draft environmental assessment report, and then review of the final environmental assessment report. So, if we go back to our federal process slide, the flowchart slide, if we can bring that back up again, that'll show, there we are. That shows the overall process. So, we sit right now, as I mentioned before, sort of the at the environmental assessment notice of commencement. That's where we sit right now, just entering the assessment phase. So as I mentioned before, we're moving into the sort of the core of the project in terms of the baseline studies. Um, there's a number of studies that are undertaken, a huge number of studies that are undertaken as part of this project, and we're gonna be talking about those studies as we move through the project, so that you can understand and follow what field staff are doing, the kind of technical work they're doing, also how community members can get involved in that field work if they're interested in joining the technical teams to go out and do the field work as well too. So there's a lot of activities that are going on at this stage, and for the next couple of years as well too. So you see that we conduct the environmental assessment, we circulate a draft environmental assessment report, and then submit a final environmental assessment report, and then you have, if the project is approved and able to proceed, then it would move into detailed design where um, you're moving from preliminary engineering, which is what we are undertaking now in parallel with the environmental assessment, where we have a general idea of where the road would go. We move into the detailed design where we have to collect more information to understand more specifically and design the road to a higher level of detail based on the information that's available for specific areas. And then once that detailed design has been developed, those drawings have been developed, then you would move into a contractor would be hired, or contractors would be hired, and then you move into a construction phase after that. So that is basically where we are now in the process. It's just a general overview of where we sit in the process. Again, we're going to be continuing in a couple of weeks with more topics that parallel where we are. So in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the federal impact assessment process, because that process um, it is underway to a degree, but it will be definitely moving along much more quickly by that point. So we'll be talking about that again in a couple of weeks, and just to lead you through that process so that you can see where we sit with that. And that wraps up today's discussion on what's next in the environmental assessment process. We hope it was helpful and encourages you to join us again in 2 weeks. Don't forget to keep in touch with our respective team members via the information available on our website, which is northernroadlink.ca. And we will talk to you again in 2 weeks when we talk about the federal impact assessment process. So miigwech, and we will see you again in 2 weeks.